You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, September 27th. I'm Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and this is The Outcue. This week, we're going to go into a discussion of sensitive information and the editorial decisions and processes that go into determining what does and doesn't get mentioned on the air. Now, this comes from a recent story that involved naming a juvenile who was charged with a serious crime, and we heard a lot from members of the audience questioning it, wondering what went into the decision, and in some cases even wondering about the legality of it. So, with me today is our news director, Sheila Miller, and our senior digital content manager, Robert McFerren. And the three of us would make up the brain trust that makes those decisions. And so let's start with when juveniles are involved and the kinds of things that we have to consider. Particularly when you're talking about a juvenile charged with a crime. People think that you're not allowed to name juveniles. That's not true. There's nothing that makes it illegal. But what are some of the things that weigh heavily on you guys when we have to decide whether or not to name a juvenile? Because it's not an easy decision.
Right. It definitely takes time and thought. We do not rush into it. But there are things. The very first thing that we all consider is the charge. What are the charges or the charge? The felonies usually,
especially if they're violent.
Exactly. Yeah. What else? Just if there's any future or if there are other victims. How many victims are there? How many known victims are there, and how many unknown victims are there? Is there some type of,
pattern?
Pattern, right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, we always take into consideration that when we're writing these stories, because, we don't take stories down traditionally. That's something we don't do.
Right.
So it's, this is a permanent record. So when we go through this, there's a thought process that goes into this is this helping? Who does this help? Does this help, the public to be aware, or is this, impacting someone's future?
Right.
So,
No, that's a really good point, because there is an impact whether you do or don't.
Yeah.
And somebody's gonna get hurt by it, arguably, but do you hurt more people potentially if it's something there's a pattern of?
Right.
By shielding it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, because something worse could happen down the road, and if we decided not to report this, you can't predict, which one way or another, but it's a decision we have to look at and consider.
And oftentimes we will call for, officials in court to help us out a little bit. What if, the juvenile prosecutor is considering bumping it up to adult court, bumping it up to the common pleas level? If they're considering that, well, then that weighs into our decision. It doesn't make the decision, but you put all the do's and the don'ts in their columns, and you decide what to do.
And circumstances matter too. I can think of one case where it was a murder charge, and the person charged was very young. I believe 13. Mm-hmm. And initially, all we knew was a name, an age, and a charge, and we didn't know the circumstances. Well, that was a case I can recall where we did not immediately name that kid, because you've got to play out what it could be. Is it possible that they were screwing around with a gun and accidentally killed somebody? They're going to face charges, but they were basically being a kid, and you don't necessarily, you have some feel for the fact that would really, really be damaging. And then when more facts came out and it was an accusation of what appeared to just be cold-blooded murder, then the name went out there.
Right.
In 2009, we had a famous case that was followed around the country over in Pennsylvania, where an 11-year-old boy had allegedly shot his father's girlfriend in a homicide.
Pregnant girlfriend.
A pregnant girlfriend.
Yes.
And this drew out for a long time, and the charges were eventually, I believe, dropped on the case.
Right. Oh, I'm glad you brought that one up, because that's actually a really good example of we follow it through. Mm-hmm. This is not a bump and run thing. If somebody's going to be exonerated, we will clear their name as loudly as we ever put it out there to begin with. Jordan Brown is the one you're referring to. We
Right.
followed that for more than a decade.
Yeah. I mean, I was at the Vindicator time. We named him, but I mean, New York Times, Washington Post, NBC News, all named him.
Right. And that's what people, because we did get some, feedback, obviously, from the most recent one. And they don't realize we're not breaking any crimes or doing anything wrong. A police report will name the accused. It was the Supreme Court back in 1979 that says, First Amendment rights to the journalist. They can name whatever they want as long as they obtain that information lawfully and as long as they report it truthfully. Well, that's what we do, here. So that's a no-brainer. But we're not breaking any law. We're allowed to name them. And a lot of organizations across the country, they have their policies. And this is our policy. We have certain criteria that we follow. And then we name them or don't name them.
And I think that we have always prided ourselves on being a more thoughtful organization than many others.
Right.
There is sort of a caricature of television news, and we bucked that every chance that we can.
Right.
And so a blanket black and white policy, we do this always, we don't do this always. We really don't have those kinds of policies.
No, and in this most recent incident also, we were getting a little bit of pressure from the community because they were thinking everything was getting shoved under the rug. We weren't reporting on it, but we were not comfortable at what information we had at that point a couple of days before to go with anything. So then when we got more solid information from other authorities, then we
charges
made the
were
decision.
officially
Yes.
filed. A police report was not enough in that
Yes.
case. There could be cases where it is. In that
Right.
case, it was not.
Right.
Another thing, speaking of just the thought process that I don't think people consider because they always see, the impact on this person who was named.
And that community.
And they only think of it in terms of the negative impact. And they say, well, and almost always they will say, well, I shouldn't say almost always, but if they're defending that person, if they know them, they will almost always say, well, their name's going to be cleared. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they are not. But what I wish more people understood is that when we report on somebody being accused of a crime, we're not saying this person committed a crime. We're saying the police arrested them, the courts charged them. There's government entities that wield a lot of power, and they have come after this person.
Right.
If they're guilty, there's a public right to know that. But if they're innocent, the more attention that's drawn to that, the stronger their case is to fight for their innocence. So it actually, in many cases, is helpful that the name be out there, even though obviously it would, in the moment, make their circumstances more emotionally difficult to deal with.
Right. Yeah, nobody wins. I mean, it's bad, and we're all parents as we sit here. So, but we also have a job to do, and that's to put the news out there, whether good, bad, or indifferent. It has to be put out there. I have to bring up one example. This isn't a news organization, but I came across this weeks ago, and ironically, it just ties in a little bit. But it was that sheriff down in Florida that they were just, the whole country across the nation. You have these bomb threats coming into schools. Well, this sheriff down in Florida just had it and was done. And he says, I'm going to start posting. If we catch any of these people that are calling in these threats, we're just posting. I'm going to put their mugshots out there. So he put the threat out there on social media. Dang it, if they didn't catch an alleged 11-year-old calling these threats in, he threw the mugshot right up on the social media site. And then further down the line, like maybe a few days later, they got a 17-year-old put mugshot up. And obviously with social media, everyone back and forth, good and bad with it. But they were done. They're like, our resources are thin going after all of these bogus threats.
Right.
And he just wanted to prove a point. It was causing, a lot of detriment to that whole community and that educational system. So it was like, here.
And there's serious crimes they should be
Yeah,
fighting
that
as.
one's, that's
Right,
serious.
right. And that being said, if we were in that situation, we would not have necessarily the same discussion they had. It
Right.
would depend on a lot of things. It's just like, if a kid gets caught at school selling, say, marijuana, I personally would be inclined not to name them.
Right, right.
If they were
Exactly.
caught selling heroin, I'd think a lot differently. I'm not sure what call would be made. I'd need
Right.
to know more
Right.
information.
Right.
If they assaulted somebody, I'm leaning much more towards, and there's a line that's crossed,
Right.
especially when you're talking about a crime that has a high recidivism rate or a high history of escalating. Because there's a community we have to look after too. I don't think, you mentioned us all being parents. Speaking for myself, and I'd like to get your guys' reaction to this too, on the days where we have to name a juvenile, I go home feeling very heavy. Those are not good days. Those aren't days where I'm going, oh, I got them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, there's stories you celebrate, and that's definitely not one you feel good about,
No,
because
no.
everyone is hurt by this.
Right.
There's no winners here.
Right, right. That's where just news in general gets the bad rap, that we're not human. We're like these robots that just put, stuff out there and all the, made up stuff, and it's not. We put the news out there. It is what it is. I mean, I would love.
And I like the fact that when these stories do come up, we have long discussions. These are not just let's just do it. It's a long discussion, and we often play, let's throw what about this? What if this? So we even go through scenarios, think, just to make sure that we're making the right decision on this.
Right, because it's our community too, because we're all from the area
all live
too.
here, so.
So.
Right, and we really do see this as public service. This
Right.
is something that this community, we rise and fall with this community. We're
Right.
not doing anything to
Right.
hurt the community.
Right.
And doesn't mean we're perfect. There are calls, I'm sure, that we've made that we'd like to take back. We wouldn't, but it's never done without a great degree of thought. Now, on the flip side to that, you mentioned the Supreme Court decision that says, that it's up to us. We can name anybody we want, which does mean victims too. There's nothing that says we can't be naming victims. And there are cases where we do. A homicide victim is almost always named, but somebody who's deceased is not a living person that has rights that they can exercise. But that is also a tricky decision. For instance, sex crimes, there's, in college journalism discussions, there's an argument to be made that naming victims of sex crimes might be a good thing because it could reduce, false accusations or something like that, have everybody with some skin in the game. There's a flip side to that there's a victim here who has historically not been believed, and you're going to create a chilling effect. But we do weigh those things, and we generally do not name victims of sex crimes.
Right.
But I can think of times we've interviewed them and they've said they wanted to tell their story and they wanted to attach their name to it. So they have agency there.
Right.
What are some other ones that you can think of where we might have a discussion where there's a victim of crime? That is a tricky one, like a robbery. We'll name the store that got robbed or the bank that got robbed, right?
Well, a lot of times when there's, what do you call it, like robberies, burglaries of a home, like older people live, not even older, anybody, but we try not to really show the house unless
Yes.
there is like a huge police presence. They had to, I don't know, break down the door because the suspect is inside, but we're very conscientious in terms of the actual, what the house looks like. We don't even...
And you
Yes.
brought up, if it happened in front of a store, it had nothing to do with it. It was a coincidence that it happened in front of the store. We don't try to bring this name of this business, because why should they be impacted by something that could potentially hurt their business of, that happened at their store,
Yeah, that's true. I can remember another organization in recent weeks. There was something that happened and it was just on the road and it was near an establishment, had nothing to do with that establishment. But I saw a shot specifically of that business's sign. Now, any reasonable person can see the story and if they're listening, know that it didn't have anything to do with the business, but people don't hang on our every words. It's a passive way that you're listening.
And your brain absorbs what you see,
Right. So you're associating them. So that is something that you would consider. And with the houses, sometimes we even have to think beyond what people have thought for their own good. They'll say, I want to talk to you about it. You can come over here right now. And they're not saying, don't show my house. But we're telling our crews, you do this in the living room and you don't show where the windows are and you don't give details as to I'm alone every night at such and such a time, just like every other night, but this night,
Right.
I mean, in old print journalism, they gave exact addresses to where this happened. I mean, they would tell you, so you sometimes could, if I was a bad person, I would see, oh, well, this happened. I know there's no one home here. If I wanted to do something else to this house now, I knew exactly where to go. So, I mean, we've gotten better at that. We don't give exact address. We'll give blocks or,
Is that an evolution, or was there a different, I mean, Robert, for those of you who don't know, I mean, Robert had 30 years at the Vindicator before coming here. Was that an evolution in thought, or was it just there was a specific idea behind why you guys would do that?
I think it was an evolution in thought. I think, that you realize that, we are, because you would occasionally take that call that someone died, we printed the address, and, oh, boy, they're at the funeral, their house got robbed.
Right.
These type of things.
Yeah, you don't need to make it easier for people.
No.
You can find things like addresses online. We don't need to give them a roadmap.
Yes.
Correct.
Now, another area that has come up this year at least, and it's probably come up other times too, is when there's a public official involved in some ancillary capacity. Obviously, if it involves them in the course of their business, their public business, there's no question about that. But the one I'm thinking of is a candidate for Trumbull County Commissioner who owns a building that houses a business that was raided by the Human Trafficking Task Force for allegations of illegal activity involving, I guess, solicitation and prostitution. A lot of details are not out yet on that, but when it got raided, some outlets did not mention who owns that building. We got comment from him. And that, to me, wasn't that tough of a decision. This is a public official, and people, we didn't accuse him of anything. But we did have to weigh that, and others did have a different decision to make on that. So I guess I don't really have a question so much as just reflecting on what we think about in those instances.
Yeah, I mean, it's the public official part of it. I mean, he is. I mean, he's, in charge of, not really in charge of, but he oversees whatever city/township in terms of ordinances that are passed there or money, like where it's going. I mean, he has his hands in the makings and doings of a community. So he's a public figure.
Yeah, and if we know this public figure has, just any association with it, are we not, I mean, it seems like if we're not naming or at least pointing it out just so it's, to clear, just so everyone's aware, that this person owns this. Not saying that there's anything wrong here, just the fact that they own it. That way it's on the table.
And another consideration there is that, this is somebody who's running for county commissioner and is a current trustee in the jurisdiction where this happened. So there's no allegation that there's any pressure on a law enforcement agency, but they do have a level of power inherent over those agencies. So the public has a right to hold everybody accountable and make sure that the investigation is not tainted by even if it is ancillary or tangential involvement of this person who holds more power than the average person does.
Right.
Another thing I would say about that one, though, was that there were rumblings about that for a long, long time, and we'd worked on it for a long, long time, and held back to make sure that we had all our ducks in a row, and also that it wasn't injected as part of a political campaign, but rather outside of the campaigns.
There was another instance, and I know I won't know all the details, but this was years ago, and it was another public official that rented out property, same almost as the most recent one. And I believe that they did sort of a raid on the building, and there was drug activity inside. And at that time, we named the individual again in that county capacity. It's just because they were the landlord of this building.
Yeah, I think I recall the one you're talking about. I'm not going to say in case I'm wrong, but I think I remember the one you're talking about. Now, Robert, you've told a story before of, and I won't remember the details, but you will, where you at the Vindicator, you guys had uncovered something and it was so close to an election that you didn't run it right away.
Yeah, there was a candidate for a very high office that we were tipped that they had a website that they were running. And so we started looking into it and did find indeed what the person was claiming was there. We reached out to that candidate, and it was the day before an election, and we had to weigh whether we could print this because this definitely would impact the election. So we had to weigh, do you do this, or do you have to go through the process? If this person gets elected, we run the story, and then we could possibly have to go through, getting this person now out of office if this person is charged.
And that's a tough one to weigh,
Yeah,
right?
it
I
is.
mean,
What'd you decide?
We decided we should not impact the election because it was too close, that we couldn't do everything we needed to do to properly vet our story. We had it. I had screen snapshots of everything. I knew what we had, and I was confident, but we had a long discussion, and we decided we were going to wait. Luckily, the person lost.
So
There's
it's
no
a
need
matter-
for a story.
So it was the matter of, like, you had the nuts and bolts, but not necessarily all the context?
We had it. We called them for content, and as we were calling and talking to them on the phone, they literally started taking the site down. Page by page, they were taking it down while I was on the phone with them.
See, because that's interesting to me, because I'm not sure that I agree with the decision, to be honest with you.
That day I was mad. I'm not going to
Right,
lie, I
right.
was mad. But we had a discussion, and that was the decision. And it's like, I felt, that this could cost taxpayers dollars.
Because of the potential for a removal effort if they regretted their vote and you would withheld
if this
the
had been,
information.
Probably a week out, we probably would have done it. But being the day before, it was just we needed more time, we felt.
Did you say what kind of website it was?
It was an adult website. Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, like.
So it wasn't illegal, correct?
Right,
It was
that's
not
what I'm
illegal.
trying
It was
to-
not illegal.
Okay.
It was just a moral, I guess, choice.
yeah.
Because that weighs
Well,
in too.
yes, it does. I would almost agree with what you did.
Yeah, and that was
then.
so there was nothing illegal about it, but it was just a public official that would have been looked on differently because of this information coming out.
But yeah, that does make a big difference.
Yes.
If it was illegal,
yeah,
I couldn't see
if it
holding
was
back.
illegal, yes.
Whereas
yeah.
if it's a moral thing, I think
Right.
there's a discussion as to whether it's a story even after they're elected.
Yeah.
It might be,
Yeah.
but again, it's all the
Yeah.
details
Yeah.
and the context.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories that we just don't throw it on the air.
Yeah, that one near,
Discussions.
that near the election thing is always a fascinating one to me. You see government agencies say that a lot too about, like, I mean, you've seen it. There's an argument over whether or not there should be another presidential debate because voting has already started.
Yeah.
And I question that thinking, though. Sometimes it's close to an election. Okay, don't the people need to know before then?
Right.
I mean, that was a discussion in the 2016 election with the emails when.
Yes.
So.
Right. But it does get to whether or not it should be, whether or not it's criminal, and how big of an impact it would have on their ability to do the job, I suppose. And that did weigh in when we were talking about Rick Hernandez owning that building and what we had heard might be happening. I mean, look, we had, for a long time, we had seen the advertisements, we had verified where it was advertised, we had seen the evidence of what could be going on inside this building. And we had to consider, and so there was a primary election. We didn't want to necessarily do
Right.
this and make it a campaign issue, but we also knew that the voters needed to know long in advance before a general election whether or not this weighed into their decision. And they deserved to hear, and quite frankly, the candidate deserved to have this put out there, because people knew, there were people rumbling on social media, and they were making big leaps far beyond what we could do factually.
Right.
And he had an opportunity to deny or affirm or whatever he wanted to do. And as it happens, he's decided to defend not only himself as a landlord, but this business in question. And that was his decision to make.
Right.
The point of all of this is that this is just never done without a great degree of thought. It's a newsroom's a great place for people who like academia but also don't have the patience for it, because every now and then you get to slow down and have these discussions and then put them into action.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a boatload more examples and just not
No.
coming up with them. Just about every day there's some type of editorial decision that's pretty high up there in terms of what to do.
Well, in terms of things that happen every day, another one that comes to mind is things like car accidents and what you can and can't see, and who might not know already if somebody's severely injured. Look, it happened on a public road. I can't very well hold back that this road is closed due to an accident. what if I can see the injured person in the video?
Right.
Or what if there's police activity and I know some of these people are undercover? Legally, there's no reason that we can't show these people outside this house.
Right, right.
But that's a consideration.
Yeah, I'll never forget being called into an edit bay, and they're like, Sheila, what can we show? This was, oh gosh, a long time ago. And it was a young kid, I think, that got shot on a basketball, an outdoor basketball court. And I said, and then of course we got there right away and had the body. I think it might even have been covered. I go, nope, not going to show it. I mean, in fact, I don't think it was covered. That's why we said no. But another example, when you brought up the accidents, when the whole drone, first started, we just got into the drone business, hired the guy, and there was a bad accident on a highway, like 76, I believe it was, and he was able to go up and get good bird's eye view. Our crew wasn't there. They had the roads blocked off because it was so bad. And we had to make the decision how much we were going to show and if we were going to hurry up and show it on the web, because nobody's family's been identified. It's a fatal accident.
Yeah.
He's coming from the other way, the drone. He's able to zoom in, see everything. I'm like, if I am a mother at home and I'm watching this and I know my kid's coming home
Right.
and I see the car and nobody's called me yet, because you will be able to make out the car to a certain extent and be freaking out.
Yeah.
So we just held back a little bit until we knew the family was identified.
Well, and in fact, we do that routinely when somebody's dead, whether it be in an accident or a homicide or just anything that might gain public attention. We know that coroners' offices have a policy of not releasing names until they've notified at least immediate families. Some families, you've got extensions where you'd never release a name if you had to get to everybody, but at least the immediate family. And we often know the name before that happens. But the only way that we know that the family knows is when the coroner's office releases it. And many times, competitive instincts aside, we wait until that's publicly released because I want to win on a story. I don't want to win on a story enough to do that kind of damage to a family.
Right, exactly. That's what, it was sensationalistic for us to get this great video of this drone, but I'll hold off on it until we know, OSB has contacted whoever they needed to contact.
Right. There are numerous other things that we're not thinking of even as we sit here, because these are decisions that are made literally on almost every story we do. I mean, there are feature stories where we have to have these discussions sometimes because we might have heard something about somebody involved with a business, and is it relevant here? And I guess the takeaway that I wish everybody knew, and I hope everybody learns from watching this, is just that whatever image you may have of media as being vultures who swoop in and that it's all about, that old saying where people would say, if it bleeds, it leads. That's cheap. That's cheap garbage. That's not what we do here. I can't speak for other organizations. I've seen some bad journalism, obviously, we all have. But you can't paint with that broad brush.
Right.
Final thoughts, anyone?
No, not really.
I mean,
We said it all.
I think we take this very seriously, and it's always thought out. And I think it's one thing that's very good that we do here, that we are very sensitive for everybody's sake.
Right. I mean, the whole locally owned plays in because we are locally owned and we're local from. I mean, we are here for the community.
Another topic I thought of that fits in with this a little bit is the use of mugshots. Some organizations don't use them at all.
Oh, yeah, right.
And others use them judiciously. I've seen mugshots on stories we've done where I wish we hadn't used them. But I've also seen stories where I cannot believe an organization didn't use the mug based upon some of these same considerations, because that will have an effect that follows somebody. We've also removed mugshots that used to be on a story because new information led to that person's exoneration. The story stays up because it's a document of history, but it doesn't need to have a picture of them at their worst moment anymore.
Right.
That's not so much a discussion, it's just another area that's just sort of run of the mill, that you do those kinds of stories, but you don't do them lightly.
Right.
With that, We will be back next week, but until then, if there's anything that you think we should be looking into, anything that you want us to investigate, anything that you want us to hear, share your thoughts with us. You can reach us at 330-744-8821. You can reach us at news@wfmj.com or watchdog@wfmj.com. And as always, please like and subscribe to the Outcue, and we will see you next week.